Experts discovered a forgotten photograph of 5 children, their innocent faces frozen in time, hiding secrets that would remain buried for over a century. What these researchers uncovered when they finally traced the haunting image's origins revealed a truth so disturbing it left even seasoned historians visibly shaken. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. On a grey January morning in Washington, D.C. Dr. Lucy Gilmore's hands trembled as she sliced open the manila envelope. Inside, nestled between brittle sheets of tissue, lay a black and white photograph that would change everything she thought she knew about American history. The photograph had arrived from an anonymous donor, with only a cryptic note, "They deserve to be remembered." As the head archivist at the National Historical Society, Lucy had handled countless historical artifacts. But something about this particular item sent a chill down her spine. The faces in the photo were eerily lifelike. 5 children, their eyes somber, their postures rigid. It was almost as if they were staring right through the decades, pleading for someone to finally hear their story. 3 boys and 2 girls, dressed in early 20th century clothing, stood in front of what appeared to be a large Victorian house. Lucy estimated the photograph was taken around 1917. Judging by the clothing styles and photographic technique, Dr. Gilmore, her assistant, Marcus, knocked gently on her office door. "The restoration team is ready whenever you are." Lucy nodded without looking up. "Tell them I'll need carbon dating and a full spectral analysis. There's something unusual about this photograph." Marcus lingered in the doorway. "Is everything all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Maybe I have," Lucy murmured, reaching for her magnifying glass. In the corner of the photograph, barely visible to the naked eye, was a small inscription: "The Blackwood 5, June 21st, 1917. The date matched her initial assessment, but the name meant nothing to her. Yet, she carefully placed the photograph in an acid-free folder and locked it in her desk drawer. Her instincts told her this wasn't just another historical curiosity. These children had a story, one that had been deliberately buried for over a century, and now, for whatever reason, someone wanted that story to resurface. As Lucy gathered her notes, a notification pinged on her computer. The anonymous donor had sent another email. "When you discover who they are, you'll understand why they were erased. Be careful who you trust." Lucy stared at the message, her academic excitement giving way to unease. What had these 5 children witnessed? And why would anyone want to erase them from history? A letter, yellowed with age and folded with careful precision, accompanied the photograph. Lucy's fingers trembled slightly as she unfolded it, revealing handwriting that wavered across the page like an uncertain heartbeat. The ink had faded to a rusty brown, but the words remained clear enough to read. According to the letter, the photograph had belonged to Eleanor Whitman, a Massachusetts woman who had taken whatever secrets she knew to her grave at the age of 94, but not before insisting repeatedly to anyone who would listen that the image held the key to unraveling the infamous Pimmon case. "The Pimmon case," Lucy whispered, her academic interest immediately piqued. The unsolved disappearance of 5 children from the small coastal town of Millfield in 1918 had haunted Massachusetts for generations. Despite extensive searches and investigations, no bodies were ever found, no culprits ever identified. The case had gone cold within months, leaving behind nothing but theories and heartbreak. As Lucy continued reading, the names leapt from the page like sparks from a fire. Roman, Juliet, William, Lucas, and little Maggie, the 5 children from the photograph, the 5 children who had vanished without a trace on that foggy October morning. She felt a chill race down her spine, despite the warmth of her office. Professor Harrington, her research assistant, James, appeared in the doorway. "Are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." Lucy couldn't tear her eyes from the letter. These names, James, they match perfectly. Roman Pimman, Juliet Lochner, William and Lucas Dawson, and Margaret Maggie Sullivan. She finally looked up at him, her expression a mixture of academic excitement and something darker. This isn't just any photograph of random children. These are the Millfield Five, photographed together just days before they disappeared. James crossed the room to look at the image over her shoulder. But that's impossible. The police report specifically stated there were no known photographs of all 5 children together. Exactly, Lucy said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. Which means either the historical record is wrong or... She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The Pimman case had been her academic obsession for years, but always from a historical distance. Now, holding tangible evidence that had somehow eluded investigators for over a century, Lucy felt the comfortable barrier between past and present dissolving. These weren't just names in dusty police reports anymore. They were 5 smiling faces staring back at her, unaware of their impending fate, pulling her deeper into a mystery that had remained stubbornly unsolved for 105 years. The Pimman family had been Boston royalty, occupying a magnificent brownstone mansion on Beacon Hill's most prestigious street. Their textile empire stretched across New England, employing thousands and amassing a fortune that would be worth billions today. But on December 18th, 1920, the entire family, parents William and Eleanor, along with their 5 children, simply vanished. The household staff arrived that morning to find breakfast half prepared, beds unmade, and no sign of struggle. The family's automobiles remained in the garage, their bank accounts untouched, their passports still locked in the study safe. No one ever found a single trace, Lucy whispered, more to herself than to Dr. Harmon. Not a body, not a ransom note, nothing. For decades, theories had flourished like weeds. Some believed they'd been murdered by business rivals from the Chicago textile wars. Others suspected a kidnapping gone wrong. The more scandalous whispers suggested William Pimman had been involved in unsavory financial dealings and fled with his family to South America. The most outlandish theory claimed Eleanor, rumored to have dabbled in spiritualism, had led her family into some bizarre ritual suicide. Lucy's fingers trembled as she traced the edges of the photograph. 5 children in formal attire, their expressions solemn yet somehow innocent. The eldest boy, perhaps 12, stood protectively behind his siblings. The youngest, a girl no more than 4, clutched a porcelain doll. Their clothing spoke of immense wealth, fine wool suits for the boys, intricate lace dresses for the girls. Most known images of the Pimman children were actually newspaper reproductions. Lucy explained. Grainy, poor quality. This could be the only authentic photograph of all 5 siblings together. Dr. Harmon nodded gravely. And you believe this connects to the artifacts found in the basement? Lucy felt that same chill return, spreading from her spine outward. The photograph seemed to pulse with an energy she couldn't explain. These children had disappeared without a trace over a century ago, their fate one of Boston's most enduring mysteries. Now, looking into their eyes, Lucy couldn't shake the feeling that they were somehow looking back, across the decades, trying to tell her something. I don't just think it connects, she said quietly. I think it's the key to everything. Dr. Samuel Pollan arrived at the university the following morning, his skepticism evident in the tight line of his mouth, a forensic genealogy expert with 20 years of experience. He'd heard countless claims of historical anomalies that inevitably dissolved under scientific scrutiny. Yet when Emily spread the photograph across her desk, his expression transformed. He leaned forward, adjusting his glasses with trembling fingers. This is extraordinary, he whispered, tracing the outline of the children without touching the surface. The photographic technique, the silver gelatin process, It's consistent with early 20th century development methods. For the next 3 days, they immersed themselves in archives. Emily's office transformed into a war room of historical records, census data, and family trees. They cross-referenced birth certificates, obituaries, and school enrollment records. The evidence mounted with each document they uncovered. The Harmon family lived at 14 Oak Street from 1912 until 1921, Samuel confirmed, pointing to a property deed. 5 children, exactly as shown here. Emily nodded, comparing clothing details against fashion catalogues from the era. Juliet's dress, see the pin-tuck pleating and the particular lace collar. This was distinctive to children's formal wear between 1915 and 1917. The most compelling evidence came from a church registry they discovered in county records. All 5 children had been baptized at St. Mark's Episcopal Church, their birth dates matching the approximate ages in the photograph. "What troubles me," Samuel said on the 4th evening, "isn't just the photograph's authenticity, but this." He pointed to Maggie, the second youngest child. Her platinum blonde hair was perfectly styled in ringlets, yet unlike her siblings, she stared not at the camera, but somewhere beyond it, her eyes holding a distant, almost knowing expression. Children rarely maintained such perfect stillness during long exposure times, Emily noted, yet there's no blur around her at all. Samuel rubbed his eyes, and there's something about her gaze. It's unsettling. Like she's looking at something the others can't see, Emily whispered. Or someone, Samuel added, his voice dropping lower. I've analyzed thousands of historical photographs. Children from this era typically displayed either rigid formality or obvious discomfort during photography sessions. But this girl looks like she's seeing a ghost, Emily finished. Samuel's face had grown pale. Or perhaps, he said slowly, she's the one who became one. A breakthrough finally came when Samuel unearthed a yellowed Boston Herald Society column from 1915. The fragile newsprint crackled beneath his fingers as he carefully unfolded it on the library table. Lucy leaned in, her shoulder pressing against his as they scanned the faded text. The article covered a charity gala hosted by Boston's elite, listing the prominent Pimen family among the attendees. Charles and Evelyn Pimen had brought all 5 of their children, including, Lucy's finger stopped at the words, their adopted daughter Margaret, Maggie Pimen, whose striking resemblance to the late Mrs. Eleanor Pimen has been remarked upon by all who knew the family matriarch. Adopted, Lucy whispered, her brow furrowing. That can't be right. Samuel pulled out the photograph they'd been studying for weeks. The 5 Pimen children stared back at them. Their familial resemblance unmistakable, the same high cheekbones, distinctive eyebrows, and slight tilt to their smiles. Maggie, second from the left, looked no different from her siblings. If anything, she bore the strongest family resemblance of all. This doesn't make sense, Samuel muttered, comparing the photo to their genealogical charts. Why would they adopt a child who coincidentally looked exactly like their own biological children? And why specifically note her resemblance to the grandmother? Lucy tapped her pencil against her notepad. Maybe adopted meant something different back then. Or perhaps it was a polite fiction to cover something else. They exchanged troubled glances as the implications began to sink in. The timeline they'd constructed showed Evelyn Pimen had been away in Europe for nearly a year before Maggie's birth. Charles had remained in Boston, running the family's shipping business. What if... Lucy hesitated, almost afraid to voice her suspicion. What if Maggie wasn't adopted at all? What if she was Charles's daughter but not Evelyn's? Samuel's face paled. That would explain why they'd call her adopted, and why she looked so much like her siblings and grandmother. It would also explain why Maggie's birth records are missing from the family Bible, Lucy added. The question is, who was her real mother? They both stared at the photograph again. The 5 innocent faces now holding a century-old secret that was slowly unraveling before them. The Pimmon family tree suddenly contained a branch that had been deliberately obscured, and they were getting closer to exposing a truth someone had gone to great lengths to hide. Their investigation took them to the outskirts of town, where St. Mary's Orphanage still stood, a weathered Victorian building with ivy climbing its brick walls. The administrator, a stern woman named Mrs. Caldwell, initially refused to help, citing confidentiality policies that extended even to century-old records. But when James mentioned the Pimmon name and showed her the photograph, her expression changed. "Wait here," she said, disappearing into a back office. 20 minutes later, she returned with a dusty manila folder, its edges frayed with age. "This shouldn't exist," she explained. "Most records from that era were destroyed in the 1950s fire. But this was kept separately in the director's personal safe. Inside the folder lay the answer they'd been seeking. Documentation for one Margaret Shelmarine, orphaned at age 3 when both parents succumbed to the devastating influenza pandemic of 1918. The Spanish flu had claimed over 50 million lives worldwide, leaving countless children without families. Margaret had been one of them. "This doesn't make sense," Emily whispered, scanning the yellowed pages. Oh, if she was Margaret Shelmarine, why was she in the Pimmon family photo? The next document answered that question. An adoption certificate dated April 12, 1919. Margaret Shelmarine had been legally adopted by Thomas and Eleanor Pimmon. But something was odd about the paperwork. Several sections appeared to have been altered, with different handwriting filling in crucial details. "These records have been tampered with," James noted, pointing to inconsistencies in the ink and penmanship. A small envelope slipped from between the pages. Inside was a handwritten note from the orphanage director at the time. "Child placed as requested. No questions asked. Payment received in full." Emily's hands trembled as she read it. This wasn't a normal adoption. They bought her. The implications were staggering. Maggie Pimmon, the woman they'd believed was a blood relative of the Pimmon family, had been purchased like merchandise. Her true identity deliberately obscured. But why? What made this particular child so important that the Pimmons would go to such lengths to acquire her and then present her as their own? "There's more," Mrs. Caldwell said, pointing to a notation in the margin of the intake form. "Look at her place of birth." The location listed sent a chill through both researchers. Blackwood Manor. Margaret's family history began to take shape as Lucy pieced together fragments from old Union newsletters and court records. Connor Shelmarine had been no ordinary factory worker. He was a force of nature, a man whose thunderous voice could silence a room of tired laborers and ignite their collective will to fight. In 1914, he had led 300 workers in a walkout that paralyzed Pimmon Textiles' main production facility for 6 weeks, demanding safety measures after 2 young women died when their dresses caught in unguarded machinery. Connor was blacklisted after that strike, Lucy explained to James as they sat surrounded by photocopied documents. But he kept organizing secretly, moving between factories under different names. Pearl Shelmarine's story was equally heartbreaking. Employment records showed she had worked 14-hour shifts, 6 days a week, her pay docked for bathroom breaks or moments of rest. Hospital records noted her 3 miscarriages, attributed to chemical exposure and exhaustion. Yet somehow she had managed to bear and nurture little Margaret. What troubled Lucy most was a newspaper clipping from 1917 reporting the death of William Pimmon Jr., the factory owner's only son, in what was described as a tragic accident during labor unrest. The article carefully avoided placing blame, but subsequent police reports painted a different picture, suggesting Connor Shelmarine had been present when a confrontation turned violent. "I think I understand now," Lucy whispered, her voice barely audible. "The Pimmons didn't randomly select Margaret after the fire. They specifically sought her out." James leaned forward. "You're saying they took her as some kind of revenge, or atonement, or both?" Lucy spread out a timeline she'd constructed. 2 months after William Jr. died, the Pimmins suddenly adopted Margaret. They didn't save her from the fire, they orchestrated her separation from her parents. The realization hit them both like a physical blow. The photograph wasn't documenting 5 random children saved from a tragedy. It was capturing the moment a calculated act of vengeance was disguised as charity. The Pimmins had taken the daughter of the man they believed responsible for their son's death. But why keep the photograph? James wondered. Why document evidence of what they'd done? Lucy stared at the image of little Margaret, her eyes haunted. Perhaps guilt, or perhaps as a trophy. Either way, they made sure she never knew her true heritage. Medical records from the county hospital provided the final, chilling piece of the puzzle. Among Maggie's birth documents was a detailed description noting a distinctive birthmark on her right cheek, described as a curved, slightly raised mark resembling a healed laceration. Lucy's hands trembled as she pulled out the Pimmins family record she'd collected earlier. There, in faded ink on a death certificate, was the description of their biological daughter, Elizabeth, who had died at just 11 months old. Bears characteristic familial marking on right facial cheek. They chose her because she looked like their dead child, Lucy whispered, the realization washing over her like ice water. The timeline was undeniable. Elizabeth Pimmins had died 3 years before Maggie's adoption. For 3 years, the couple had grieved until they'd seen a child at the orphanage with the same distinctive mark as their lost daughter. It couldn't have been coincidence. The orphanage records showed dozens of available children that year, yet they'd specifically requested Maggie. They weren't just looking for any child to adopt, Professor Williams said, studying the documents over Lucy's shoulder. They were looking for a replacement. Lucy thought about the strict rules, the peculiar clothing, the insistence on certain behaviors that Maggie had described in her journals. They were trying to recreate their daughter, she said. They even changed her birthday to match Elizabeth's. The photograph made more sense now. The stiff posing, the formal dress, the way Maggie was positioned slightly apart from the other children. The Pimmins hadn't wanted just any child. They'd wanted their daughter back, and Maggie had been molded to fill that impossible role. Imagine living your entire life as someone else's ghost, Lucy said, her voice barely audible. Never allowed to be yourself, because you were chosen to replace someone who was lost. The professor nodded gravely. And Maggie never knew. She just thought she wasn't good enough, that she was failing to meet their expectations somehow. Lucy gathered the documents, her mind racing. This wasn't just about identifying children in an old photograph anymore. This was about uncovering a stolen identity, a life manipulated to serve someone else's grief. And somewhere in this twisted history, Lucy sensed, lay the answer to what had happened to the other children as well. The investigation took a darker turn when we obtained Connor Shelmarine's death certificate. While officially recorded as an influenza casualty during the 1918 pandemic, inconsistencies emerged that couldn't be ignored. The attending physician had noted unusual bruising around the neck, but ultimately attributed death to the raging illness sweeping through the country. Dr. Harmon, our forensic consultant, reviewed the documents and raised immediate concerns. These markings are consistent with asphyxiation, not influenza complications, she explained, pointing to the faded medical notes. Someone may have taken advantage of the pandemic chaos to disguise murder. Even more disturbing were statements from elderly residents who remembered that period. 97-year-old Martha Wilkins, then a neighbor's daughter, recalled strange visitors to the Shelmarine home just days before Connor's death. 2 men in dark suits came late one evening, she told us, her voice quavering with the weight of century-old memories. I remember because they weren't from town, and strangers were rare then. My mother said they spoke with Mr. Shelmarine for nearly an hour. County records revealed that Edward Pimin had business connections to a private investigation firm in Chicago, the same city where those mysterious visitors allegedly originated. Financial records showed a substantial withdrawal from the Pimin account 3 days before Connor's death and another larger sum 2 weeks after. The timeline was becoming horrifyingly clear. The Pimins, desperate for a child and rejected by adoption agencies, had likely hired men to eliminate Connor and stage an abduction of little Mary. With both parents devastated by their son's death and distracted by grief, taking the girl would have been tragically simple. They created the perfect smokescreen, Detective Lawson observed grimly. A family already suffering from one tragedy wouldn't immediately suspect another was orchestrated by the same hands. What had begun as a curious historical investigation had transformed into something much more sinister, a cold case of calculated murder and child abduction. The innocent-looking photograph that started our journey now seemed to capture 5 children, one of whom would soon become a victim, and another an unwitting prize in a deadly scheme orchestrated by a desperate couple willing to destroy one family to create their own. The discovery happened on a Tuesday morning. Samuel had been overseeing the restoration work at the old Pimin mansion when one of the workers called him over. They'd removed a section of the ornate wainscoting in what used to be the master bedroom and found a small compartment behind it. Inside was a bundle of yellowed papers tied with a faded blue ribbon. "Lucy, you need to see this." Samuel's voice trembled over the phone. "They're letters from Evelyn Pimin." 3 hours later, they sat in Samuel's office, the letters spread across his desk. Lucy's hands shook as she read the damning words written in Evelyn's elegant script. "It's working." One letter from 1917 stated, "The child responds to Margaret now, though I still call her Maggie. She's stopped asking about her parents. Dr. Holloway assures me the treatments will continue to suppress her memories." "This is monstrous," Lucy whispered, reaching for another letter. "Listen to this. We've told her she was ill for many months, which explains her confusion. Harold has burned all her old clothes and anything that might trigger recollections of her former life. We've instructed the staff never to mention Ireland or speak of her arrival." Samuel paced the room, running his hands through his hair. They systematically erased her identity. They stole not just her body, but her mind. The letters documented a calculated campaign spanning months. Evelyn detailed how they'd isolated Maggie, restricted her contact with servants, and created an elaborate backstory about her being born into the Pimin family. They'd even fabricated childhood photos and mementos, but the most chilling letters came from late 1917. "The child woke screaming again last night," Evelyn wrote. "She spoke of strange dreams, a small cottage, the smell of cabbage soup, a man speaking words I couldn't understand. Dr. Holloway has increased her medication, but I fear her true memories are fighting through." Another letter mentioned Maggie humming an Irish folk song she couldn't possibly have learned in the Pimin household. "Harold is concerned. The child remembered something today that happened before she came to us. A festival in her village where she danced. We told her it was just a story she'd read, but she became quite insistent." Lucy felt tears welling in her eyes. Her mind was fighting back. Samuel, even as a 5-year-old, some part of her knew. "The question is," Samuel said, collecting the letters with careful hands, "did she ever fully remember? And what happened when the Pimins realized they couldn't keep her past buried forever?" Lucy stared at the final letter in the bundle, dated December 23, 1917. It contained just one sentence. "Harold says we must take more permanent measures. The child remembers too much." Evelyn's final letter was dated just 3 days before the family's disappearance. The yellowed paper trembled in Sarah's hands as she read the desperate, hurried handwriting that slanted across the page. "She knows, Roa. The child knows what we've done. The words seemed to pulse with a frantic energy that transcended the century-old ink. Maggie woke screaming again last night. She described the cabin by the lake in perfect detail, right down to the blue curtains in the window where it happened. She couldn't possibly remember that place. She was too young. Sarah passed the letter to Daniel, whose face grew increasingly grim as he read on. "Charles is beside himself," Evelyn had written. "He paces at night, muttering about loose ends and final solutions. I fear what he might do. Yesterday, he burned all the photographs from that summer except the one you have. He says we need to disappear before questions are asked that we cannot answer." The letter detailed how their carefully constructed life was unraveling thread by thread. Maggie, despite being only 4 years old when the incident occurred, was somehow recovering memories that the adults had desperately tried to bury. She asked about the boy yesterday, the one who fell. How could she remember? "We've been so careful never to speak of it." Daniel set the letter down, his historian's mind piecing together the fragments. "They were running from something terrible," he whispered, "something they all witnessed or participated in." The final paragraph was the most disturbing. "Charles says we have no choice but to leave everything behind. He would rather vanish into thin air than face what's coming. I'm afraid Roa, not just of discovery, but of him. There's a darkness in his eyes I've never seen before. He keeps checking the cellar door, making sure it's locked. What has he done? What are we becoming? If anything happens to me or the children, you'll know why. You'll know who." The letter ended abruptly, without a proper closing, as if Evelyn had been interrupted mid-thought. Sarah and Daniel exchanged troubled glances. The Blackwood family hadn't simply disappeared, they'd fled in terror, pursued not just by potential scandal, but by the fracturing of their own minds as guilt and fear consumed them. "Charles would rather disappear than face exposure," Sarah murmured. But what exactly were they running from? What happened at that lake? Lucy and Samuel stared at each other, pale and shaken. The weight of their discovery hung in the air between them like a physical presence. What had started as an academic exercise, a curious investigation into a set of vintage photographs, had morphed into something far more sinister. The Pimmon case wasn't just a dusty historical mystery. It was a century-old crime scene that had never been properly investigated. "Murder," Lucy whispered, her voice barely audible in the quiet laboratory. "Kidnapping, psychological torment, all of it hidden in plain sight for over 100 years. Samuel nodded grimly. "And no one was ever held accountable." He gestured to the scattered documents on the table. These children were victims, not just subjects in a photograph. Lucy gathered the papers with trembling hands. "We need to notify the authorities, even if it's just for the historical record." "But that's just it," Samuel said, his eyes suddenly widening. "I don't think this is just history. Not anymore." He pulled out a folder they hadn't yet discussed. "The lab results came back this morning. Those preserved hair and tissue samples we found in Pimmon's collection. They're intact enough for DNA analysis." Lucy leaned forward. And we found a match in the national database." Samuel's voice grew quiet. "Lucy, there's a living relative, Maggie's half-brother, Timothy O'Neill." "That's impossible," Lucy breathed. "He'd have to be 108 years old," Samuel finished for her. "And he's alive, Lucy. In a nursing home in Cambridge." Lucy felt her heart racing. "We need to talk to him. Today." "I've already called. He's lucid, though frail. The nursing staff said he rarely has visitors." Lucy began gathering their materials. "He might be the last person alive who knows what really happened, who knows the truth about those 5 children. And about Pimmon," Samuel added darkly, "about what he did to them." As they packed up their evidence, Lucy couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The photograph of the 5 children seemed to follow her with its collective gaze, 5 pairs of eyes silently pleading for justice across the span of a century. "Do you think Timothy will talk to us?" she asked. Samuel paused at the door. "I don't know, but after 105 years of silence, I think someone needs to speak for those children, and Timothy O'Neill might be our last chance to learn the full truth." Timothy's condition had deteriorated rapidly in the past months. Sitting in his wheelchair at the care facility, he stared vacantly at the wall, occasionally mumbling fragments of childhood memories that no one could piece together. The team had hoped he might provide confirmation about his sister, but dementia had stolen that possibility. Dr. Harlow watched him with a heavy heart, knowing the answers they sought were locked away in a mind that could no longer access them. "We received the DNA results this morning," Dr. Harlow told Professor Bennett as they walked down the corridor. "There's absolutely no doubt. Maggie Pimmon and Margaret Shelmarine were genetically identical. They were the same person." Bennett stopped walking, letting the weight of this revelation sink in. So the Pimmons did take her. They stole a child from their enemies. The historical record suddenly made perfect, terrible sense. The Shelmarines and Pimmons had been locked in a bitter land dispute that had turned increasingly hostile. Court documents from 1917 showed accusations flying between the families, with threats documented by local authorities. Then, during the chaos of the influenza epidemic, little Margaret Shelmarine had vanished without a trace. "They took advantage of the pandemic," Dr. Harlow said, flipping through her notes. "Death records were poorly maintained. People were dying by the dozens. Who would question one more tragedy?" The team gathered that afternoon to review all the evidence. Census records, property deeds, family letters, and now DNA confirmation painted a disturbing picture. The Pimmons had abducted 4-year-old Margaret during the height of the epidemic, moved across the county line, and reinvented her as their daughter Maggie. "They erased her identity," Bennett said, spreading the documents across the table, "changed her name slightly, cut her off from her past, and raised her as their own. The ultimate revenge against their enemies, stealing their only daughter." Most chilling were the diary entries from Eliza Pimmon, discovered in the farmhouse attic. "The child asks for her mama sometimes," she had written in 1918. "We tell her that fever dreams made her confused. Soon she will forget completely." And forget she did. Maggie Pimmon grew up never knowing her true origins, married, had children including Timothy, and lived her entire life with a stolen identity. The photograph that started their investigation had captured not just 5 random children, but the evidence of a crime. A little girl standing among strangers who had become her family through the darkest of circumstances. "Or we need to find Maggie's living descendants," Dr. Harlow said. "Both sides of the family deserve to know the truth." Lucy's fingers trembled as she flipped through the yellowed maritime registry. For days, she'd been cross-referencing passenger manifests against the dates immediately following the Pimmons' disappearance. The answer had been hiding in plain sight all along. There, on a manifest dated 3 days after they'd vanished from Blackwood, was the listing that changed everything. Family Pember, Edward, Helen, Thomas, Elizabeth, and Margaret Ward. "They weren't murdered," Lucy whispered, her voice barely audible in the silent archive room. "They fled." The family hadn't been victims of some terrible crime, as everyone had assumed for over a century. They had orchestrated their own disappearance, taking Maggie with them. The ship, the SS Valparaiso, had sailed for Buenos Aires, Argentina, about as far from the scandal of Blackwood as one could get in 1917. Lucy photographed the manifest with shaking hands and continued searching. She found their immigration papers filed under the Pember name. Edward had listed his occupation as merchant, not the banker he'd been in Blackwood. Helen was documented as a homemaker, the children as students. Maggie, interestingly, was officially listed as their ward, not a servant. "They gave her a new life," Lucy murmured, piecing it together. "They didn't abandon her to scandal, they took her with them." Further records showed the Pembas had settled in a growing expatriate community outside Buenos Aires. Property records indicated they'd purchased a modest home and later a small shop. They hadn't lived as wealthy people, but they hadn't suffered either. Most remarkably, Lucy discovered school records for all 3 children, including Maggie. The Pimins hadn't just taken her away, they'd given her an education, something unthinkable for a servant girl in England at that time. What had driven them to such drastic measures? Lucy suspected the answer lay in the photograph itself. The way Edward looked at Maggie, the family's protective stance around her. Perhaps a scandal had been brewing, one that threatened not just Edward's reputation, but Maggie's future. Oh, they chose to disappear completely rather than face whatever was coming, Lucy told Professor Walsh when she called him with her findings. They didn't just vanish, they reinvented themselves entirely. The world had spent a century believing the Pimins were victims of some terrible fate, their story ending in tragedy. But the truth was something else entirely. They had slipped away into the fog of another continent, leaving behind only ghosts and rumors, creating new lives where no one knew their past or questioned Maggie's place among them. Months after Lucy and Samuel published their findings in the Historical Journal, Lucy's inbox pinged with an unexpected email. The sender's name, Sofia Gutierrez, was unfamiliar, but the subject line made her heart skip. Re, the lost children of SS Carpathia. Lucy immediately called Samuel, and they read the message together over speakerphone. I'm a genealogist based in Buenos Aires, Sofia wrote. Your research about the Carpathia children has caused quite a stir in certain circles here. She explained that one of her clients, an elderly woman named Margarita Santos, had approached her after reading a Spanish translation of their article. Margarita had grown up hearing stories from her grandmother about a strange blonde girl who had lived with a wealthy family in their neighborhood during the 1920s. The girl never quite belonged, Sofia continued in her email. According to Margarita's grandmother, she spoke Spanish with an accent and would sometimes sing songs in English that sounded Irish in origin. The family claimed she was a distant relative from northern Spain, but neighbors gossiped that she had been purchased from a sailor. Lucy and Samuel exchanged glances through the video call. This matched the timeline of Eileen's disappearance perfectly. Sofia's email contained more details that sent chills down their spines. The mysterious girl reportedly cried herself to sleep for months. She was kept isolated, rarely allowed to interact with other children. The family dressed her in expensive clothes and paraded her at social functions like a doll. But most telling was what happened when she turned 16. Margarita's grandmother said the girl vanished during a thunderstorm. The family claimed she ran away, but they never filed a police report. They simply stopped mentioning her existence altogether. Sofia had attached a photograph, grainy and faded, showing a young woman standing stiffly beside an older couple at what appeared to be a garden party. Though the quality was poor, Lucy could see the resemblance to the little girl from the Carpathia photograph. I believe this may be Eileen O'Malley, Sofia wrote. Margarita's grandmother said the family called her Eleanor. But once, when she thought no one was listening, the girl told another child her real name was Eileen. Lucy's hands trembled as she typed a reply. After all this time, after all their research, they might have finally discovered what happened to the 5th child. The trail hadn't gone cold in New York. It had continued across continents, into a world they hadn't thought to explore. Margarita pulled out a yellowed envelope from the box, her hands trembling slightly. Inside was a handwritten letter in faded ink. My grandmother worked for them for almost 20 years, she explained. She was more than just a housekeeper to Maggie. She saw how lost the girl felt. According to Margarita's grandmother, Maggie would often sit alone in her room, staring at her reflection in the mirror as if searching for someone else. The American family had instructed everyone to never mention Ireland or anything about Maggie's past. But the housekeeper couldn't bear to see the child so adrift. At night, when the family was asleep, my grandmother would go to Maggie's room and sing Irish lullabies her own mother had taught her. Margarita continued, her voice soft with reverence. She said the first time she sang Tura Lura Lural, Maggie's eyes lit up as if something deep inside her had awakened. These secret moments became their ritual, a small act of rebellion against the erasure of Maggie's heritage. As Maggie grew older, she began asking questions about Ireland, about her real family. The housekeeper shared what little she knew, though it wasn't much. My grandmother said Maggie kept a small journal where she wrote down every fragment of memory that surfaced: a stone cottage, the smell of peat fire, a woman's laugh. On Maggie's 16th birthday, the family threw an elaborate party announcing her engagement to the son of a prominent businessman. The next morning, Maggie's bed was empty. Her few personal belongings were gone, along with some money and a silver locket that had been a birthday gift. The family was frantic, Margarita said. They searched everywhere, involved the police, but Maggie had vanished completely. The official story became that she had been kidnapped, but Margarita's grandmother never believed it. She always said Maggie had the look of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. She wasn't taken, she was taking herself back. The housekeeper kept her suspicions to herself, secretly hoping that somewhere, perhaps across the ocean, Maggie had found her way home. My grandmother carried that belief to her grave, Margarita said, carefully folding the letter. That somewhere out there, Maggie was finally living as herself again. Margarita sent Lucy a photograph, faded, but clear enough to make out the details despite the yellowing edges. The image showed a somber young girl with platinum blonde hair that caught the sunlight like spun silver. She stood alone in a meadow dotted with wildflowers, her small frame appearing almost ghostly against the tall grass that swayed around her knees. The girl's expression wasn't simply sad, it carried the weight of someone who had seen too much, her eyes holding a vacancy that no child should ever possess. Lucy turned the photograph over with trembling fingers. On the back, written in faded blue ink and elegant Spanish script, were the words, "My darling Margaret, 1926. The handwriting was delicate but determined, the kind that belonged to someone who took great care with their penmanship. Lucy's breath caught in her throat as the realization settled over her like a cold shadow. "It's her," she whispered to herself, though no one else was in the room. "It's actually her." The girl in the photo was unmistakably the same Maggie from the Pimen portrait, only a few years older, but still bearing that same lost look. The timeline matched perfectly. This photograph was taken 3 years after the group portrait at the orphanage, while the other children in the original photograph had vanished without a trace. Somehow, Maggie had made it to Spain. But how? And with whom? Lucy carefully placed the photograph on her desk. Next to her laptop, where the digitized version of the Pimen portrait stared back at her, side by side, there was no question they were the same child. The distinctive shape of her eyes, the slight tilt of her head, even the way she held her shoulders, slightly hunched, as if carrying an invisible burden. This was the first tangible proof that at least one of the children had survived beyond the orphanage. But the inscription raised even more questions. Who was writing to Margaret with such affection? Was it the same person who had taken her to Spain? And why did Margarita have this photograph in her possession after all these years? Lucy reached for her phone. This discovery was too significant to process alone. She needed to share it with Professor Harmon immediately. As she dialed his number, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were getting closer to something both remarkable and terrifying. A truth that had remained hidden for over a century, waiting patiently to be uncovered. Lucy stared at the image, her heart pounding beneath the weight of a century's secrets. The photograph that had started it all, 5 children frozen in time, now held an entirely different meaning. She traced Maggie's face with her fingertip, understanding the fear hidden behind that forced smile. The Pimmins had escaped justice, their crimes sealed beneath layers of lies and new identities. They had died peacefully in their beds decades ago, never answering for what they'd done to those children, to Maggie. "It's not fair," Lucy whispered to Professor Harrington, who sat beside her in the archive room. "They got away with it all." The professor nodded solemnly. "History is filled with unpunished crimes, I'm afraid, but there's power in truth. Even a century later." Lucy knew he was right. The Pimmins had vanished from London after the incident, resurfacing in Manchester as the Prestons. They'd built a new life, opened a shop, and lived as upstanding citizens until their deaths in the 1960s. No one had ever connected them to the missing children or the fire that had claimed 3 young lives. But Maggie's true story had finally clawed its way to the surface. A tale of loss, manipulation, and survival against all odds. The journal entries they'd discovered in the attic of the old Pimmins house revealed everything. How the couple had taken in orphans, not out of charity, but for the government stipends. How they'd worked the children to exhaustion. How they'd punished any disobedience with cruelty that made Lucy's stomach turn. "What will you do with all this information?" Professor Harrington asked. Lucy gathered the documents, carefully placing them in her archival folder. "I'll make sure Maggie's story is told. The other children too, William, Edward, and the twins. Their families deserve to know what happened. After 105 years, especially after 105 years. Lucy's voice strengthened with resolve. Time doesn't diminish the need for truth. As she packed away the evidence of long-buried crimes, Lucy thought about Maggie's remarkable escape. How she'd managed to flee during the chaos of the fire, a fire that investigators now believed had been set deliberately to hide evidence of abuse. Maggie had made it to Scotland, changed her name, and built a new life, haunted forever by the faces of the friends she couldn't save. "Sometimes," the professor said, breaking the silence, "the only justice we can offer is remembrance." Lucy nodded, closing the folder with finality. "Then that's what we'll give them. A place in history that can't be erased or forgotten again." Lucy stood by the window of her hotel room, watching the rain pelt against the glass as the Smithsonian prepared for tomorrow's press conference. The photograph that had started it all, 5 children on a porch in 1915, would soon take its place in American history alongside the full accounting of what had happened to them. But one question nagged at her more than any other. What happened to Maggie after 1926? She whispered to herself, tracing raindrops with her finger. The records showed that Margaret Thompson had disappeared from public documents after her testimony in the Hargrove trial. No marriage certificate, no death certificate, no census entries. It was as if she had simply vanished into the ether, perhaps changing her name to escape the notoriety. Professor Williams had theorized that Maggie might have moved west, starting fresh where nobody knew her connection to the scandal. Many did that back then, he'd told Lucy. Reinvention was the American way. Had Maggie found peace in her new life? Lucy wondered. Had she married, had children, lived to old age with the weight of her knowledge? Or had she carried her secrets to an early grave, haunted by what she'd witnessed? And perhaps, most importantly, had Maggie ever learned the whole truth about what happened that summer day? Had she ever discovered why Harold Hargrove had targeted those specific children, or that her own grandfather had helped cover up the crime? Lucy pulled out her notebook, reviewing her findings one last time. The photograph had exposed more than just a historical crime. It had revealed the dark heart of a family willing to sacrifice innocent lives to protect their reputation. The Hargroves had used their wealth and influence to bury their sins, and nearly succeeded in erasing 5 children from history altogether. "The truth always finds a way," Lucy murmured, remembering her grandmother's words. The evidence they'd uncovered would ensure that Tommy, Elizabeth, Samuel, Catherine, and little James would never be forgotten again. As she packed away her notes, Lucy felt a strange sense of completion. Tomorrow, the world would know what had happened to those 5 children. Their families would finally have answers. Justice, though delayed by more than a century, would finally be acknowledged. Yet something told her that Maggie's story, the lone witness who'd carried this burden, remained unfinished. Perhaps somewhere, in some dusty archive or forgotten attic, the final chapter of Margaret Thompson's life was waiting to be discovered, and Lucy couldn't shake the feeling that finding it would be her next journey. The world would never see the Pimmins the same way again. What had once been a tale of tragedy and misfortune was now revealed as something far darker, a calculated betrayal spanning generations. The museum had removed the family's portraits from their prominent displays, relegating them to the archives with new contextual information that told the complete story. Several historians published revised accounts of the region's history, carefully documenting how one family's obsession had altered the course of so many lives. Lucy found herself giving interviews to documentary filmmakers and journalists, though she declined most requests. "I didn't uncover this story for fame," she told her mother over tea. "I did it because those 5 children deserved the truth to be known." The photograph that had started her journey now resided in a special exhibition about historical revisionism, alongside the evidence she had meticulously gathered. Thomas Pimmin's descendants had issued a public statement expressing their shock and regret, establishing a foundation to locate any remaining descendants of the Blackwood children. 3 families had been found so far, their ancestors having changed their names and scattered across the country to escape the shadow of what had happened. As for the mansion, it stood empty once more. The Historical Society had voted unanimously to convert it into a memorial and research centre dedicated to uncovering suppressed histories. Lucy had been offered the position of inaugural director, which she was still considering. On her last visit to the property, Lucy stood in the garden where the photograph had been taken. The ancient oak tree still stood, though now she knew what had happened beneath its sprawling branches. She unfolded her copy of the photograph, those 5 innocent faces staring back at her across more than a century of silence. "I hope it's enough," she whispered to the empty garden. She understood now that some ghosts never truly fade. They wait, patient and silent, for the truth to finally set them free. And in bringing that truth to light, Lucy had freed not only the spirits of 5 forgotten children, but something within herself as well. The weight she had carried since finding that photograph had finally lifted, replaced by the quiet certainty that even the most carefully buried secrets eventually find their way into the light.